Well, yes, John. Yes, I got the clip, and I'm going to play it to the listeners now. So let's have a listen. Well, that was pretty awful, wasn't it? Normally, John, I'd say send that transceiver straight back to the dealer where you bought it from. But of course, in this particular case, it wouldn't have been appropriate, would it? Well, hello and welcome once again to the Waters and Stanton video channel. My name's Peter Waters. Of course, I'm his Golf 3 Oscar Juliet Victor. And if you're wondering if this mast is leaning a bit, yes it is, because when I put it in last year, I just put a stake in the ground. I didn't put any concrete in, so that's a job I've got to do later on. I should also explain that the reason I'm doing this video outside is because it's such a lovely day. Do you know that a week ago we had snow on the ground, and here we are now with spring-like weather. There's buds on the shrubberies over there. There's the snowdrops that have come out in bloom. And it is, what, 2/3 of the way through February, and it's 17 degrees at the moment. Quite amazing. Anyway, the introduction that you just saw was a recording I made a bit earlier for a talk-in that I was asked to do. A bit of fun, but you know that radio, didn't it sound terrible? I mean, if you had a radio like that, wouldn't you send it back to the dealer? Well, yes, except perhaps I should explain. That was a recording of a spy radio designed, what, 80 years ago. It was designed at the beginning of the Second World War. But you know, a lot of these videos that I do have been sparked off by emails I get and conversations I have on the air. I had a conversation the other day with a station on 80 metres, and he explained that he'd just switched his gear on. He was using the FT 400, FL 400 series, separate transmitter and receiver, which was quite common 50 years ago, whenever. And he apologised for the drift, and there was drift, and we drifted, or he drifted around about, I suppose, about 500, 600, 700 hertz in the course of about 10 minutes. It was some switch on, of course, but I was fascinated to know that he was still using the gear, and it reminded me of days gone by when we had to contend with drift. And I had a link passed me on this spy radio that I really had heard of, but didn't know much about. But you know, going back in time, drift was common. Believe it or not, yes, drift was common. It was something we had to live with. So, let me just tell you the story. So drifting, let's talk about drifting. You know, it's not a very common problem these days. In fact, it's quite rare. But if we go back in time, it was something we lived with. You know, in the days when I was first licensed, oscillators were basically free running devices. And if the temperature changed, the coil dimensions would have changed slightly, and it would have caused a frequency drift. And of course, the heat generated by valves was one of the major reasons for drift. But you couldn't avoid it. You know, the valves got hot, the temperature rose, and the oscillators drifted. There was quite a clever way of dealing with it, which was called a temperature compensated capacitor. In other words, the capacitor value changed as the temperature changed, and the idea was that it would compensate for this temperature change and for the frequency change, and therefore make the oscillator more stable. But it only worked to a degree, and it still caused temperature to have an effect on the oscillator frequency. And of course, oscillators were present in both receivers and transmitters. And of course, at those days, you had separate transmitter and separate receiver. So the receiver would drift and the transmitter would drift. And you know, if you were in QSO And of course, a lot of the transmissions they were AM. If you're in QSO with the station and his transmitter drifted, so you adjusted your receiver. And of course, your transmitter was also drifting, so he would adjust his receiver. Sometimes you'd move up the frequency slightly in parallel, but sometimes you'd work in opposite directions. So you could start off with a QSO where you were both roughly on the same frequency, but end up where you were either both on a frequency higher or lower than you started off, or more likely you were on different frequencies, and you could be separated by 2 or 3 kilohertz. Occasionally you'd perhaps check and find out where you both were, and then try and get back onto the same frequency. But it was quite common for stations not to be quite on the same frequency. That was okay if it was just a QSO between 2 stations. If you happen to be on a net, then it caused major problems, because stations would be drifting in different directions, and you'd have to keep adjusting. And one of the topics of conversation every so often was, Bill, I think you've drifted, can you come back on frequency? So operating nets in those days could cause a problem, but we live with it. And because you were transmitting AM, drift wasn't so noticeable as it would be on CW, and certainly on single sideband. So drift was one of the things you had to live with, and if you were looking at the specification of equipment, you looked at the drift figures and how far, what the manufacturers claimed in terms of stability. Now, the amateur bands are basically harmonically related, and that was really intentional. It meant that if your harmonics were higher than they should be, you would just be interfering with the next ham radio band up, and so forth. So that was one of those things. But because the bands were harmonically related, a lot of the transmitters, for example, were also working on harmonics. In other words, the basic oscillator, for example, could be on the 80 meter band. Let's say it was on 3.5 megahertz. So the basic oscillator was on 3.5 megahertz. If you wanted to operate on 7 megahertz, you just had an amplifier that was tuned to the second harmonic, and then you had a transmitter that covered 80 and 40 meters, and you could go on up there. You could have another one that amplified the fourth harmonic, which would be on 14 megahertz. The problem now, of course, was that on 14 megahertz, drift was 4 times the problem as it was on 80 meters. So on 80 meters, it wasn't too difficult to get a reasonably stable oscillator, but any drift would be multiplied by a factor of 4 on 14 megahertz. So drift was a problem in those days. And the other thing was that in the early days, and I say early days, I can only go back to 1960 only. Yeah, it's a long way back, isn't it? In those days, we didn't really know what frequency we were operating on. We tried to avoid the edge of the bands because we didn't know quite how far we were near the edge of the bands. We didn't have digital readout. The easiest way of checking frequency was with a crystal, but of course you didn't have a crystal for every frequency. There was the BC221 frequency meter, which was designed to give you some indication. It was an oscillator basically, and it was designed to give you a fairly accurate indication of where your transmission was. But in order to find out where your transmission was, you first had to listen to the signal of your transmitter on a receiver, then tune the BC221 to the same frequency, then read out the dial indication on the BC221, and then look at the chart to see what frequency it was. So it's quite complicated. In practice, what happened? Well, we relied on the calibration of our receivers, which wasn't great. Receivers were generally calibrated 10 or 20 kilohertz points on the dial. You relied on the fact that it was basically roughly right, and provided you didn't go too near the edge of the top of the band or the bottom of the band, you were okay. And you also relied on the fact that everybody else probably was doing the same thing. So you're all quite happy, but you didn't actually really know what the exact frequency was. You certainly know whether you were drifting, but you didn't quite know what frequency you were operating on. Now, that would cause a problem today, because there are so many websites that give information about DX operation on stations and where they're operating on what frequency, usually within 1 kilohertz, and probably more accurate than that. In those days, you couldn't do it. You could say we'll meet on 80 meters at the middle or the top end of the band or something like that. And that was basically as accurate as you could really get. But things got better. We had, we found that, or we found it was starting to become common to have a crystal reference oscillator and a variable frequency oscillator. And you could then beat those two together and extract a frequency from those, either plus or minus. And that started to give you greater stability, but it didn't completely overcome the problem until we had synthesizers. And when we had synthesizers, then things became much more stable. And of course, that also tied in with the time when we started to have digital readout. So once we had digital readouts and once we had synthesizers, then things were so much better. And it was just as well we did have those, because SSB required greater stability, and we also needed to operate on the same frequency, because if two stations are drifting apart, then they're taking up twice as much space as they should do. And in fact, somebody gave me a link recently to another channel where the headline said 40 meters only had 6 channels for SSB. Well, of course, 40 meters never did have any channels on it. None of the ham radio HF bands had channels on them. And SSB doesn't take up a 10 kilohertz chunk of space. You can certainly get 2 SSB stations very comfortably in 10 kilohertz of space and almost squeeze 3 in. Bit of elbow room, but you can just squeeze them in. So it was a headline sort of catching, sort of eye-catching thing, but it wasn't quite right. So we're now sort of coming back to the present day, when we've got some very good frequency stability, excellent frequency stability. And of course, digital modes, some of the digital modes require great stability. And mustn't forget, of course, VHF. VHF and UHF in the early days was very much crystal controlled. It had to be crystal controlled. That was the only way you could get any measure of stability, because you were still multiplying up. And I can remember the first VFO controlled receivers and transceivers for VHF, which were mind-boggling, really, that you could actually have a VFO that worked on 2 meters. Well, of course, nowadays we have VFOs that work on 2 meters, 77s and 23 sems. 23 sems, there's still a few issues there, I think, with some equipment, a bit of drift, but really and truly, drift is no longer a problem. You should, for normal operation, you should find that your transceiver is totally stable. And if you want to meet somebody on, I don't know, 3.75, 6.5, you'll probably end up on the same frequency. And I mean, I hear stations occasionally talking and checking frequencies, and they're measuring it in hertz. I mean, that was unheard of back in the early days. Unheard of. In those days, as I said, we didn't even know what frequency we were on. So, funnily enough, one of the requirements was that you had to have a wave meter, an absorption wave meter, so you could check your transmission, so you could check that you were on the band you thought you were on and not on a harmonic. I mean, a wave meter is a pretty crude device, really. It's okay for measuring field strength, but it really was not much good for checking on harmonics and so forth. But there we are. It was one of those things we had to have. We also had station inspections, which I don't think you have now. But we used to have station inspections. I had to look at the logbook. I think I had 2 inspections. But it turned out, they were usually carried out by guys that were also amateurs, and unless you were doing something really bad, it turned into a sort of a half-hour chat over a cup of coffee. But I did have two station inspections. I had to show them a logbook, and I think I had to produce a wave meter. But as I say, a wave meter was really, it was a curious thing to have. Anyway, we've progressed there. So today, modern equipment, very, very stable. I was looking at the figures recently. The most popular HF transceivers in the last year has been from ICOM and from Yaesu. Elecraft have fallen out of the graph because the K3 production stopped and the K4 production hasn't picked up yet. So the most popular HF transceivers is undoubtedly the IC7300, wins hands down because it was the first of the new breed of HF SDR transceivers, and it's been going for about 4 years now. And the 7610 is also popular, but of course it's getting on for twice the price, so it's less popular than the cheaper one. Yaesu FTDX101 came on stream, and that was really Yaesu playing catch up. Unfortunately, it's quite expensive, so it still let the 7300 in and have quite a big share of the market. But now Yaesu have come up with the FTDX10. I've got the FTDX10 here, which I've been playing with for a few days now, and once I've got to grips with it and assessed it, I will do a video on that. So that's where we are. The FT991A is a popular transceiver because not only does it cover the HF bands, but it also covers 2 meters and 77s. So that's quite a popular transceiver. They are the ones that we're selling lots of. IC705, that is starting to pick up now. I've noticed a few sales going through the last week on IC705s, and that's because we've got through the snow, we've got some sunshine, and we've got the promise of a bit more freedom this year. Fingers crossed. So there we are. That's what I've got to say about drifting around, drifting along, as we all do. I hope it's been of interest to you because it's, you know, it's. I think it's sometimes interesting to look back on what stations, the way we operated, and what we had to put up with, and what we certainly wouldn't put up with now. Now, at the beginning of this video, I did promise to talk about spy radio. It's actually the Paraset spy radio, which was a radio that was first used behind enemy lines at the beginning of the Second World War. But I'm looking at the time scale on this video, I'm heading towards 20 minutes, and I don't really want to talk too long. So I'm going to make that a separate topic and come back to that because it's quite an interesting device. 80 years old, would you believe? Yeah. So we'll come back to that one in an upcoming video. In the meantime, enjoy your ham radio, take care. Oh, press the subscribe button if you think we're in the right area and we're doing some interesting videos. And thanks for your support. Our shop is still closed, but our mail order system is very, very busy indeed. And we're getting great support from the likes of UPS and Parcel Force and DPD and so forth. I understand that the service from those couriers is not so good from Europe, and that's because of the paperwork, not because of the couriers themselves. Anyway, there we are. That's it. Take care. Enjoy your ham radio. Speak soon.